So in the last lesson, we looked at feature detecting our notification on our window object, and we learned some of the basic concepts of a notification. So now it's time to take the next step, which is to then, before we can send any user notifications, we need to ask permission if the user wants to actually accept them. So instead of our console log, we can access this notification. Now, if you hit the dot, you're going to see a few different things. You can see length, max actions, name, permission, prototype, all these different things. Now, if we go and type in permission, what I'll do for now is just quickly console log this out. We'll save this out, and you can see that we have default. Now, there are three different types of permissions available. There is granted, there is denied, and default. Granted is when a user accepts the permission, denied is when we reject the permission, and default is essentially as is, where we haven't accepted or denied. So we get to ask the question, or perhaps the user has closed the notification or just completely ignored our request to see if they want to have notifications, because that is an option as well. Now, instead of console logging out the permission, we're going to call a function called request permission. What this then allows us to do is use a promise. We can say .then, and you can see we have this onFulfilled callback as well as an onRejected callback. So what this will allow us to do is give us the permission, and we can say console.log that permission out. So when we save this, we're going to see in our local host that we want to show notifications. And I'm pretty sure that you'll have browsed the internet and been asked this question by particular websites that you browse. So now if we say allow, we then get a string of our permission, which is granted. Now, much like many of these new APIs, we can actually click things such as here, and we can ask again, we can refresh. This then allows us to block. We then get denied. And finally, as I mentioned, there are three different options. The default being that we haven't accepted or rejected. If we were to close this, we then have default. So there's two essentially rejection scenarios and one accepting scenario where we do want those permissions. Now, because we're using modern JavaScript, instead of using a promise, what I like to do is use async and then the await syntax. So that means that we can just completely get rid of our .then, and we can clean things up quite nicely. We can say const permission equals, and we can just simply await for that request. This would then allow us to do something like this, where we can switch on that permission statement. We can then create a case. Now you can see that the types have been inferred here. This is a nice superpower of using something like VS Code with some type definitions behind the scenes. So what we're going to say is that we want to create a case for granted, and what we can simply do inside is permission was granted. Now, of course, with all switch statements, we do want to remember our break clause, otherwise they're all going to execute. We then have another case if the user was going to deny, which inside we can say again, console.log permission was denied. Now, these are obviously going to run after the user has made a selection, and therefore we could, if we want to, create them a nice message. Now, instead of creating a case where we say that we want the default, we can of course do this, but of course a switch statement indeed has a default statement that we can run if neither of our granted and denied do in fact execute. So not only does it cover that default use case, it will run if there is potentially anything else that happens. So here we can say console.log, and we can just add permission was not granted or denied. So now if we save this out and hit refresh, you can see that we have our permission was granted. We could then go back to our notifications. We could block, refresh our page. You see we have permission was denied. So this will allow us to request the permission from the user, and then it might be that we want to show them some kind of user feedback that says, thanks for accepting the notifications. You'll now receive alerts of something happening in the future. Otherwise, you might want to respect their wishes and say, okay, thanks for denying the permissions. If you want to use them in the future, feel free to go ahead. So that's it for this video. We've looked at the async and await syntax. I think you'll agree that this is quite nice. It flows quite nicely, and we don't need to put switch statements inside of our .then callbacks, because our request permission returns us a promise that we can then create a nice switch case from. So that's it for this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to start building out some new notifications and then focus some browser tabs after some click events.